The Tour de France was not held during World War II because the organisers refused German requests. Although a 1940 Tour de France had been announced earlier, the outbreak of the war made it impossible for it to be held. After that, some attempts were made by the Germans during the war to have a Tour de France to maintain the sense of normality, but L'Auto, the organising newspaper, refused. Some other races were run as a replacement. After World War II, L'Auto was closed for collaborating with the Germans. The rights to organise the tour went to the French government. As two newspapers were interested in these rights, they each organised a small tour of 5 stages, and the race run by LA Permail Cup was considered the most successful, therefore LA Permail Cup could organise the 1947 Tour de France. History. Already before the war, the political situation in Europe had its influence on the Tour de France. Political reasons caused Italy, Germany and Spain to refuse to send teams to France for the 1939 Tour de France. The 1938 Tour de France winner, Gino Bartali, was among those affected. Henri Desgrange, the original race organizer, and Jacques Goddet, his deputy and replacement, announced plans for a Tour de France in August 1940. Races planned or held during the occupation. 1940 Tour de France Henri Desgrange planned a tour for 1940, after war had started but before France had been invaded. The route, approved by military authorities, included a route along the Maginot Line. Teams would have been drawn from military units in France, including the British, who would have been organised by a journalist, Bill Mills. The plans were dropped after the German invasion. The records and paperwork of the tour were taken south to keep them safe but were never seen again. Desgrange died in August 1940, and his successor, Jacques Goddet, initially wanted to organise the tour during the war, arguing that sport should remain neutral. 1941 Tour de France In 1941, the newspaper Paris, run by Germans, tried to persuade L'Auto to co-organise the tour, but Goddet did not accept. 1942 Tour de France The German propaganda staff wanted the tour to be run and offered facilities otherwise denied, in the hope of maintaining a sense of normality. They offered to open the borders between German-occupied France in the north and the nominally independent Vichy France in the south, so that L'Auto could organise a tour, together with La France Socialiste, but Goddet refused. He was, in any case, in little position to run a race of that scale because many of the staff had left L'Auto's office in Paris to go south. 1942 Circuit de France La France Socialiste, run by Jean Louliet, Goddet's former colleague at L'Auto, did not have the same reluctance, and organised the race on its own. Louliet, who had been manager of the French team that won the Tour in 1937, had become head of sport at La France Socialiste which, despite its name, was a right-wing paper that sympathised with the Germans. Louliet assembled 69 riders for the race, the Circuit de France, which ran from September 28 to October 4, 1942. Over 6 stages and 1,650 kilometres, it went from Paris to Paris via Le Mans, Poitiers, Limoges, Clermont-Ferrand, Street-à-Permelchen, Lyon and Dijon. One of the riders, a Permel Mile Ida copyrightee, told the writer and cyclist Jean Bobet that he had been threatened with the Gestapo if he didn't take part. Bobet said, "I asked him to repeat it to see if I had understood. I was stunned." Dans l'autre section of Fait Tilt. The Circuit de France was organised between September 28, 1942 and October 4, 1942 by La France Socialiste in both the occupied zone and Vichy France, to give a feeling of nationality. The race had 6 multinational teams, and was won by Frena Section Noire Nouvelle. The inexperience of the organisers, combined with bad weather and logistical problems, made the race a disaster. Although there were plans to hold the race again in 1943, it was never held. The mountains classification was won by Pierre Brambilla. 1943 Tour de France The 1943 Tour de France was not held, but instead, L'Auto organised a readers' poll in 1943 to name the perfect team for a Tour de France, one to be run. More than 10,000 took part. equals 1943 Grand Prix du Tour de France equals, in 1943, Lauter ran what it called the Grand Prix du Tour de France, the paper's assessment of the greatest riders calculated using their placings in single-day races, all organised by Lauter. At the end of the season, a yellow jersey was given to the cyclist with the best overall classification. The winner was Joe Goutorp. Even though the Grand Prix du Tour de France was organised by Jacques Goddet, he made it clear that it was not an official Tour de France. The Grand Prix du Tour de France 1943 consisted of the following races: Paris-Euro-Roubaix, GP de Provence, Paris-Euro-Dijon, Paris-Euro-Reims, Paris-Euro-Tours, Course d'Ans Paris, GP d'Arvennes, GP des Alpes, GP Industrie du Cycle. Equals 1944 Grand Prix du Tour de France equals, in 1944, the Grand Prix du Tour de France was done again, but it was not completed because the liberation of France stopped the races from being run. Maurice de Simperlea was the leader at the time the races were interrupted. Candidate tours after liberation: after the liberation of France in 1944, Lauter was closed and its belongings, including the Tour de France, were sequestrated by the state for having published articles too close to the Germans. All rights to the tour were therefore owned by the government. Jacques Goddet was allowed to publish another daily sports paper, La Permail Cup, but there was a rival candidate to run the tour, a consortium of the magazines Sports and Miroir Sprint. Each organised a candidate race. La Permail Cup and Le Parisien Libre copyright had La Course du Tour de France, and Sports and Miroir Sprint had La Ronde de France. Both were 5-stage races, the longest the government would allow because of shortages. Equals Ronde de France equals, from July 10 to July 14, 1946, the Ronde de France was organised. The cyclists were divided in commercial teams, but the commercial teams were each allowed to field 2 teams, one composed of French cyclists and one of foreign cyclists. It was won by Giulio Bresci, who also won 2 stages and the mountains classification. Equals La Course du Tour de France equals. The Course du Tour de France, also known as Monaco or Euro-Paris, was organised in 1946 by Le Parisien Libre copyright together with L'Equipe. The race had many things familiar to the old Tours de France. There were 6 national teams and 5 regional French teams, and the leader in the race was also given a yellow jersey. The race was won by French cyclist Apu Lazarides. The mountains classification was won by Jean Robic. Aftermath: the Course du Tour de France, La Permail Cup's race, was better organised and appealed more to the public because it featured national teams which had been so successful before the war, when French cycling was at a high. In late 1946, both organisers intended to organise their race again in 1947, this time at the same time. The UCI then decided in December 1946 to give La Permail Cup the right to organise the 1947 Tour de France. After their main rival sports objected to this, the rights were instead given to La Société Copyright du Parc des Princes, because this was thought to be a neutral choice. In early 1947, it became clear that the organisation of the Tour de France was difficult financially without a newspaper and, in June 1947, 1 month before the 1947 Tour de France would start, the Société Copyright du Parc des Princes transferred the rights to L'Equipe. A Permel Besson, communist sports writer and a member of the resistance from 1943 when he was 17, called La Permail Cup's victory political. Besson, who was a member of the National Study into French Sport under the occupation, set up by Marie-Georges Buffet when she was sports minister between 1997 and 2002, said, "It was a bit much to have given them the right to run the tour again after all that," referring to Lauter's pro-German attitude and closure. Goddet had the keys to the Velodrome diver when, the Germans wanted it in the roundup of Jews in July 1942. After the liberation, the battle between left and right had the tour as one of its prizes. Goddet had to defend his wartime behavior at an inquiry in Algiers. He pointed to the way he had allowed resistance workers to print anti-German tracts at his newspaper and called a Permel Mill an Amaury in his defense. Amaury had a blameless record in the resistance. He was also a right-wing businessman. His ideals close to Godet's. It was with Amaury and his paper, Le Parisien Libre Copyright Ra Copyright, that Godet ran La Course du Tour de France. It was Amaury's reputation that landed Godet the Tour. That, says Besson, and because the rival candidate was two magazines with a communist background and President Charles de Gaulle was determined to limit communist influence. De Gaulle had spent much of his time during the war trying to prevent communist domination of the resistance. Communists held many key positions in France just before and after liberation, but de Gaulle refused even to thank them for their work. Albert Bourlin, who won the 14th stage of the 1947 Tour de France, told Jean Bobet that he was convinced that his membership of the Communist Party denied him access to the race afterwards. Amaury eventually took control of both the paper and the Tour de France, and as of 2012 is still the organizer of the Tour de France, under the name Amaury Sport Organisation. Jean Louliet was tried for his role in organising races under German patronage, but he was cleared after fellow journalists, including Godet, spoke in his favor. Notes. References. Further reading: Dauncey, Hugh. Hare, Jeff. The Tour de France, 1903 – 2003, A Century of Sporting Structures, Meanings and Values. Routledge. ISBN 0-7146-5362-4. Retrieved July 2, 2008. Thompson, Christopher S. The Tour de France, A Cultural History. Routledge. ISBN 0-520-24760-4. Retrieved July 2, 2008. McGann, Bill. Carol McGann. The Story of the Tour de France, 1903–1964. Dog-Ear Publishing. ISBN 1-59858-180-5. Retrieved July 2, 2008.